It is the summer of 1940, and the fields of Kent smell of turned earth and fear. A farmer, we will call him Arthur because his real name was never recorded, rises before dawn, crosses his yard in the grey half-light, and descends into a hole beneath the roots of an ancient oak tree. The hole is perhaps a metre wide. It is unremarkable, covered by a trapdoor of timber and turf, virtually invisible to the untrained eye. Arthur climbs down a short ladder into a chamber roughly the size of a large wardrobe, lined with corrugated iron, furnished with a bunk, a chemical toilet, and a small stove whose flue has been engineered to vent invisibly through the ground above. Around him, packed with almost obsessive care, are weapons, explosives, silenced pistols, time pencils, small, simple devices designed to detonate charges hours or even days after a man has slipped away. And beside all of this, sealed against the damp, a set of orders that Arthur has been told in the plainest possible terms to follow should the worst come to pass. He is not a soldier in any formal sense. He is a farmer, a gamekeeper, a poacher perhaps, a man who knows this particular piece of British earth better than anyone alive. And that, in the summer of 1940, is precisely what makes him invaluable. What Arthur sits inside is one of the most remarkable and deliberately forgotten pieces of British wartime infrastructure ever constructed. It is an operational base, a purpose-built underground hide. And across the length and breadth of Britain, there are roughly 3,500 of them. They are the physical foundation of a resistance organisation so secret that many of its own members did not know the names of those in adjacent units. Together they constitute something extraordinary, a doomsday network, buried in the soil of Britain, built on the assumption that Hitler would succeed. To understand why these caves were necessary, one must appreciate the almost vertiginous speed with which Britain's strategic position collapsed in the spring of 1940. In barely 6 weeks, between 10th May and 22nd June, Germany had defeated France, driven the British Expeditionary Force into the sea at Dunkirk, and occupied the entire western coastline of Europe, from Norway to the Spanish border. Britain now stood alone, its army back on home soil, but stripped of most of its heavy equipment. Roughly 68,000 vehicles, 2,500 guns, and nearly 500,000 tons of supplies abandoned on the beaches of northern France. The RAF was under ferocious strain. The Royal Navy, whilst formidable, could not be everywhere at once. And across the Channel, the German Wehrmacht, the most battle-hardened and operationally sophisticated army in Europe, was preparing what it called Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. Military planners in London understood something that the public, for understandable reasons, was not told directly. If German forces landed in strength on the beaches of Kent, Sussex and Essex, they could not simply be met at the waterline and pushed back. The British army, rebuilding and re-equipping after Dunkirk, needed time. Time that the terrain of southern England alone could not provide. The enemy had demonstrated in France, Norway, the Low Countries and Poland that it excelled at breaking through conventional defences, exploiting gaps, and advancing at a pace that turned linear defence into chaos. A static line of pillboxes and anti-tank ditches might slow the Wehrmacht, but it would not stop it. Something else was needed, something that went beyond conventional military thinking entirely. The problem that faced the planners was this: how do you make the land itself into an enemy? How do you ensure that even if German forces occupy British towns and villages, they never feel secure in doing so? How do you sustain a campaign of sabotage and disruption, not from outside the occupied zone, but from within it? From people who were there before the enemy arrived, and who intend to remain? The answer required not just strategy, but infrastructure. Invisible infrastructure. Infrastructure that could survive enemy occupation and be used after the front line had passed over it. The organisation that would provide that answer was created, almost entirely, by a single remarkable man working with extraordinary speed and almost no formal, bureaucratic sanction. His name was Colin Gubbins, a British Army officer of Scottish descent, a veteran of the Irish War of Independence, and a man with a precise practical understanding of guerrilla warfare that was genuinely unusual in the British Army of 1940. Gubbins had written 2 small pamphlets in the late 1930s, The Art of Guerrilla Warfare and Partisan Leader's Handbook, that were so far ahead of mainstream British military thinking that they had been largely ignored. Now suddenly they were exactly what was needed. Working from offices in London and drawing on the expertise of Section D of the Secret Intelligence Service, as well as the newly formed Special Operations Executive, Gubbins began constructing what would officially be known as the auxiliary units. The name itself was chosen for its deliberate blandness. These were nominally a home guard formation. An administrative cover story that would, if the invasion came, provide their members with just enough plausible deniability to avoid immediate execution under the laws of war, though most participants understood with quiet realism that this protection was more theoretical than practical. The operational base, the Ninurta, the underground cache and hide that formed the physical heart of each auxiliary unit patrol, was designed to specific standards developed in collaboration with engineers from the Royal Engineers and the General Post Office. The basic model was a corrugated iron structure, known in the trade as an elephant shelter or a Nisan-adjacent construction, buried to a depth of roughly 2 meters and accessed through a concealed trapdoor. The dimensions varied according to terrain, but a typical installation measured approximately 3 meters in length, 1.5 meters in width, and perhaps 1.5 meters in height at the crown, enough to shelter a patrol of 6 men in conditions of extreme discomfort, but survivable. The ventilation system was, given the constraints, ingenious. Air entered and left through pipes disguised as tree roots or buried beneath the surface, positioned to avoid any visible disturbance of the ground above. The entry shaft was fitted with a vertical pole mechanism that allowed the trapdoor to be pulled shut from inside, with a counterweight system ensuring the turf covering remained undisturbed. In optimal conditions, and the construction teams, working mostly at night, aimed for optimal conditions in everything, a trained observer could walk within a metre of an operational base and detect nothing. Tests conducted by regular army units asked to search for these hides produced results that, even now, are striking. In multiple documented exercises, units failed to locate operational bases even when they knew they were within a defined search area. The caches themselves were packed with a mixture of standard issue and specialist equipment. Each unit typically held several pounds of Nobel 808 plastic explosive, a pale, almost clay-like substance with a faintly almond odour, stable enough to handle safely but devastating in use. It was complemented by pull switches, pressure switches, and the aforementioned time pencils. Copper tubes containing a corrosive acid held back by a thin wire which, when a breakable ampule was crushed, would begin eating through the wire at a rate determined by the ambient temperature. Squeeze the end of the pencil, and the clock began ticking, silently, without mechanism, without any outward sign of what was about to happen. Bridge a railway line. Mine a road. Leave a charge beneath a petrol store. Walk away. Come back to the farm. Return to the field. Wait for the explosion that, hours later, would announce to the enemy that this occupied country was not as quiet as it appeared. There were also phosphorus grenades, Sten guns, American .30 caliber carbines, and, perhaps most significantly, the Welrod pistol. The Welrod deserves particular attention. It was, by any measure, one of the most effective silenced firearms ever produced. Designed specifically for SOE and the auxiliary units by engineers at a facility in Welwyn Garden City, known informally as the Fryth, it was a single-shot bolt-action weapon built around an integral suppressor that reduced the sound of firing to roughly that of a hand clap. Quiet enough, at 10 meters, to be lost in ambient noise. It was not designed for combat. It was designed for assassination at very close range, almost certainly preceded by a conversation, a shared drink, the established trust of a collaborator who did not yet know he was a target. It is a weapon that carries its moral weight differently from artillery or bombs. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The auxiliary unit patrols that would use these hides were selected with great care. Recruitment was conducted by a network of intelligence officers, regular army personnel, often with connections to rural sport or agriculture, who moved quietly through the countryside, identifying men with specific, complementary skills. A typical patrol of 6 might include a farmer, who knew the local lanes without consulting a map, a gamekeeper, who could move through woodlands silently and read the signs of human passage, a mechanic who could hotwire a vehicle or disable one effectively, and ideally at least one man with a controlled and even temperament who could wait out days of hiding without becoming a liability. They were not told the full shape of the organisation they were joining. Each patrol knew its own operational base, and, at most, the location of a secondary hide for emergency use. They did not know the identities of adjacent patrols. They were briefed in general terms on their mission, which was simultaneously simple and devastating. In the event of German occupation, they were to emerge from their hides after the front line passed over them and operate against enemy logistics for a period estimated at between a week and a fortnight. Railway lines were priority targets, signals infrastructure, fuel dumps, senior officers at isolated billets. The disruption of supply and communication, sustained across a landscape dotted with 3,500 such cells, was expected to impose a cost on any occupying force that would prove, in aggregate, intolerable. The most extensively documented operational exercise involving the auxiliary units occurred not in wartime, but in late 1940 and throughout 1941, when regular forces were invited to test the network. The results were, by the admission of those involved, remarkable. Units operating from their operational bases penetrated, defended airfields, placed dummy charges on RAF aircraft, disrupted exercise supply lines, and on one notable occasion managed to leave a simulated, explosive device in the quarters of a senior general without being detected. The general, it is reported, was not entirely pleased. What was never tested, of course, was the network under genuine occupation conditions. The question of what 6 men hiding in a cold, corrugated iron box, listening to the sound of German voices above them, would actually have done, and for how long, belongs to the realm of history's most necessary hypotheticals. Germany's answer to the problem of occupied territory resistance was developed along fundamentally different lines, which is itself instructive. The Wehrmacht and the SS never constructed a pre-prepared underground resistance infrastructure in any territory they occupied. The concept simply did not align with German military doctrine of the period, which emphasised speed, offensive action, and the psychological power of overwhelming force to prevent resistance from taking root at all. German anti-partisan operations in Eastern Europe and Yugoslavia, whilst often brutally effective in the short term, were reactive rather than preemptive. They destroyed resistance networks after those networks had formed and were operating, rather than constructing their own dormant networks before an expected reversal. The American approach to the problem was related but distinct. The Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, forerunner of the CIA, developed its own stay-behind concepts following close liaison with British intelligence, and specifically with SOE. American thinking tended towards larger, more resource-intensive solutions, longer supply chains, heavier equipment, more emphasis on air-delivered reinforcement of resistance groups already in the field. The British auxiliary unit model was in several respects more elegant precisely because it was more Spartan. The infrastructure was already in place. There was nothing to drop, nothing to deliver, no radio contact required in the initial phase. The men were there, the weapons were there, the hide was there, the enemy was simply required to arrive. The Germans did study captured documents relating to the auxiliary units after the war, along with the broader architecture of British stay-behind planning. Elements of the concept, particularly the pre-positioned cache and the cellular structure, influenced post-war NATO stay-behind networks across Western Europe, most famously the Italian operation that became known as Gladio, which remained classified until 1990, and whose existence, when revealed, caused considerable political turbulence in several countries. The corrugated iron box buried under an English oak tree had, in its philosophy at least, a longer institutional afterlife than most of those who designed it ever imagined. The actual historical impact of the auxiliary units is, in one sense, very difficult to assess, because the invasion never came. Sea Lion was postponed indefinitely in September 1940, as the Battle of Britain shifted the strategic calculus, and Hitler's attention turned east to the Soviet Union in 1941. The 3,500 operational bases were never activated in earnest. The time pencils were never crushed against railway sleepers in anger. The well-rod pistols were, for the most part, never fired at anything except training targets. This creates a peculiar historiographical problem. How do you measure the impact of a deterrent that was never tested? The honest answer is that you cannot do so with precision. What can be said is that the existence of the network imposed a planning consideration on German commanders that was not negligible. German invasion planning documents captured after the war and studied at the Public Record Office reveal an awareness that any occupation of Britain would face sustained internal resistance from a population known to be armed, determined, and organised. Whether this awareness materially altered German decision-making is genuinely unclear. Historians continue to argue the point. What is not argued is the psychological reality of the network for those inside it. The men recruited to the auxiliary units, and the organisation numbered approximately 6,500 at its peak, were asked to accept a proposition of extraordinary bleakness. They were told in words that were never written down in any document that might be found that they should expect to survive no longer than a fortnight in operational conditions, and that they should say goodbye to their families without being able to explain why. Their names were struck from Home Guard rolls. Their existence was classified at a level above most regular military operations of the war. When the organisation was stood down in 1944, following the success of D-Day and the evident impossibility of any German invasion, its members were simply told to go home and say nothing. Most of them did exactly that. Surviving examples of operational bases can be visited today at a small number of locations across Britain. The most well-preserved authentic installation is in Worcestershire, maintained by the Coleshill Auxiliary Research Team, which takes its name from Coleshill House in Oxfordshire, the country estate that served as the training centre for the entire network. The house itself was destroyed by fire in 1952, a loss that feels almost too convenient for those inclined towards symbolism. Return to that oak tree in Kent. Return to Arthur, descending his ladder in the pre-dawn grey, settling himself among the weapons and the weight. He does not know, in the summer of 1940, that the invasion will not come. He does not know that he will live out the war and return to his fields and his ordinary life, and eventually die without having told his children what lay beneath that oak. He only knows what he has been told, that if the moment comes, he will emerge, that he will make this small piece of Britain ungovernable, that he will strike and fade and strike again, until the cost of holding this lane, this crossroads, this signal box, this village that has been his family's village for generations, becomes too high for any invader to bear. This is not a story about glory. Glory requires witnesses, and the auxiliary units had none. It is not a story about triumph because the circumstance that would have tested these men was never presented to them. It is a story about a different kind of courage entirely, the courage required to prepare for something catastrophic, to accept its possibility not as abstraction, but as operational reality, and to build in the cold dark of occupied expectation the infrastructure of defiance. 3,500 holes in the ground, 6,000 men who said nothing, weapons maintained and oiled and counted and repacked, season after season, against a day that never came. There is a kind of heroism in the readiness itself, in the discipline of the hide, in the silence of the farmer returning to his field, carrying nothing, showing nothing, already prepared for the worst that could be asked of him. Britain was never occupied. The hides were never used. But the fact that they existed, that they were real, physical, present in the earth, tells us something essential about the nature of resistance, and about the strange, unglamorous, profoundly human act of preparing to fight for a place you love, in a way that no one will ever see, against an enemy that may never arrive. The oak tree is still there, the trapdoor is gone, but the hole, if you know where to look, remains.